Live united.
Live united.
Live united.
Live united.
Live united.
Live united.
Vivimos juntos.
We live united.
We live united. I live united.
Hello and welcome to Live United, a show that explores how people like you, businesses and nonprofits, are working together to make sure everyone in our community thrives. I'm your host, Milton Little. What are the best places to raise children in Greater Atlanta? And what can we do to make sure the answer to that question becomes everywhere? Well, that's the topic we're here to talk about today with our guests. And our guests are Dr. Dan Kaufman, who's the president of the Gwinnett Chamber of Commerce, Mike Alexander, manager of research and analytics at the Atlanta Regional Commission, and Nicole McGee Hall of Nickelworks Consulting and Airport South Community Improvement District. Thank you all for being here today. The idea comes from an article that was in the recent New York Times, and it talked about the best places and in fact the worst places in the country for children to grow up. The story began with a question: why do children grow up in some places to go on to earn much higher incomes than they would if they grew up someplace else? So for each one of our guests, that's really the place where we want to start. Why do children who can live in the same general community, or at least in the same city, have tremendously different opportunities to grow up and prosper? Well, let me start with you, Dan.
Thank you, Milton. Well, I think it really begins in infancy. We know now that the years 0 to 3 are the most important in terms of the development of the brain. And so the child's capacity and ability to learn is really set at a very early age. And so the kind of environment in which that young person lives has an enormous impact on later life. And so literally children who live within blocks of each other could start out in very different environments. And so from there, the kind of stimulation, the kind of environment, the kind of healthcare, the kind of nutrition that they get in those early years really does have an enormous consequence on how successful they'll be.
Nicole, what would you like to add to that?
Well, I definitely think that the environment plays a very important role. I think it's the exposure that a lot of the young people get at a young age. So if they're able to be exposed to programs and opportunities for recreation and enhancement and enrichment types programs will, actually play a bigger part as they continue on in their educational process.
And Mike, you've described yourself as a numbers guy, so is there something that the numbers tell us about?
Well, what the numbers really tell us is a very specific spatial story. There's a lot of variation in household income across our region, and really what we see over and over again is that concentration of people of similar educational backgrounds, similar income levels. And really, if you want to look at educational performance, the easiest measure to look at to know how those children will likely do will be the household income of the parents. And across the region, county by county, there are unbelievable disparities in household income. And you can really look at the school performance based on household income and really understand how those children are likely to do. And that's something that is a conversation we really have to have about how those children in those places where the incomes are absolutely at the lowest levels are likely to do.
So I want to stay here for a minute because that same New York Times article talked about Fulton County. And it said Fulton County can be and is, by the data, one of the worst places for poor children. But it also said that it's a pretty good place for kids of higher income. Let's go a little deeper into this story of disparities to help our viewers understand what's really going on, Mike.
Right, and some of our analysis, and I think fits that question and that thought beautifully, is that Johns Creek High School, the median household income of the people that can attend Johns Creek High School as a service area is $129,000 a year. And you contrast that with City of Atlanta, South Atlanta High School, their most southern high school, where the median household income is under $20,000 a year. And these are two high schools that, as the crow flies, are probably 20 to 25 miles apart.
And $100,000 difference.
Absolutely. And that's all within the same county. And if we look at the school performance, obviously there's some big differences there.
Oh, when he talks about South Fulton, he's talking about the area that you know well, Nicole.
So true. And one of the things that I will add to that is that on the south side of town, so in serving on an advisory board and dealing with the Banneker cluster at the Banneker High School, the area that serves those students don't have the same opportunities. They don't get the same, the income levels of the students and the parents are obviously lower. And unfortunately, when it comes to a lot of the programs, they're just not available. Whereas if on the northern part of town, they're different, probably because of the income of those households. And it's also important, you know, to note that the different schools offer different varieties, but you actually have to travel. So there are two magnet schools that are down south, one being Westlake and the other being Tri-Cities. However, to be in what they call a dual magnet program, you still have to travel basically midway to get to North Springs High School. So that just shows you that for that opportunity, you have to actually travel.
Exactly,
So,
exactly.
something to think about.
You talked about 20 miles, and we know that life expectancy is significantly different based on where people live. You can live in Buckhead and have a life expectancy of around 84 years, but if you live in Bankhead, a mere 5 miles away, it could be life expectancy is about 71 years. So what happens in that 5 miles that would drop life expectancy like that? We'll come back to that. But Dan, you're in Gwinnett County, a county that has seen tremendous change over the last few decades, that's got probably great examples of the kinds of differences between high and low strength and weaknesses as we've just been describing. What's the view from Gwinnett County?
Well, we've lived through this demographic change. In 1990, of course, Gwinnett County was 90% white, and today there's no majority race in Gwinnett County. We are the most diverse county in the Southeast, with significant representation of all the major ethnic groups, both white, African American, Hispanic, and Asian. And so we have seen the influence that changes in demographics can make. But we've also, we think, learned that opportunity and access to quality education makes the difference. And of course, I'm biased in that direction. To pick up on what Nicole and Mike said, think about the opportunities that young people in Johns Creek or more affluent areas, Buckhead, have with regard to access to health care, in terms of starting at birth, literally, or even before birth, all the way through their life. And so remember, average lifespan counts everybody. And so for those who die in infancy, I mean, they take it down. And so it really is, you have to think holistically about the important issue that you've raised, what happens to our children at a very early age. And in Gwinnett, we're determined to try to give them access to the kind of stimulation early in life, in pre-K, in kindergarten, so that when they get to the first grade, they're ready to perform. Because what we know now is if they don't have that kind of access to stimulation, they won't make it. They literally will get so far behind, they can't catch up.
But we also know that place matters from the standpoint of where the jobs are relative to where you live. You know, there's lots of stories of the tremendous economic boom in Greater Atlanta. And then you look a little closely and you see how much of that is in North Fulton, a long way from where the folks in South Fulton live. What do you do if you don't have access to a car and MARTA doesn't get you where you need to go? But the job that'll really make the difference that Dan is talking about is almost without, you know, your ability to get anywhere close to it. What happens to the folks, Nicole?
One of the main things that happens is what we're talking about, the education, the opportunity, all of those things suffer. they don't have the income because they can't travel. One of the things that was a major point was when the transit service stopped in the Clayton County community, and that was very critical for people just trying to get to the airport to catch MARTA to go other places within the metro Atlanta area. So you saw that the income went down, their education is definitely suffering, and even in parts of Fulton County, in South Fulton County, MARTA only goes to a certain point where it really needs to be, better. One good thing for Clayton County right now, obviously, is people will have access. They've already started in March to have access to transit, and that's actually making a difference already as far as income being able to provide. I can't necessarily speak to, I guess in the last 4 or 5 months, the changes, but I believe that you will start seeing more changes because of the fact that they'll be able to get to the income. Obviously, them being able to get to jobs, those are the parents that actually have to support those students. Will definitely, we'll start seeing some newer and better results, I believe.
Yeah, we had Keith Parker here a couple of months ago who
did you?
was speaking in anticipation of what that impact would be. Mike, from the sort of global picture, I mean, what's the demographic shift look like across Greater Atlanta over the last couple of years?
Metro Atlanta, well, like most other Sunbelt metros, has dramatically changed in its racial and ethnic composition. In 1990, we were about 70% white. Now that number is under 50% for the 20-county area. Our communities are becoming more diverse. 1 in 4 people in Gwinnett County were born in another country. That's an unbelievable demographic change in a relatively short period of time. So what we've reported on the ARC is the phenomenon that really this is very much a suburban change.
Say more about that.
Well, when I went to graduate school, I learned that immigrants, literally international immigrants, would move to the center city first. Well, Metro Atlanta, that just didn't happen. In fact, the city of Atlanta has a very small share of foreign-born population. The immigrants that have moved to Metro Atlanta have chosen Gwinnett County as the first stopping point, or DeKalb County, or our more suburban counties as they look for jobs in those areas. So that's been something that we've reported on a lot at the ARC, and communities have adapted to that. And the school systems in particular have been a big focus because for most of those suburban school districts now, there isn't really a white majority anymore. The majority of the young students are ethnically diverse. On some of them, it's not their primary language to speak English.
Sure.
And that's been a big adaptation for those school systems as well. So we're a very diverse place. That gives us a lot of opportunities, right? I'm always hear about Gwinnett County taking trips to Korea, right, for business,
Right.
because of that strong link with the Korean community.
Going
now.
next
So-
month, as a matter of fact. So, yeah.
Oh, wow.
And for us, it's an exciting time.
Right.
Because we have had all this change. And that brings energy to our metropolitan areas. Because metropolitan areas that aren't diverse, that don't have that, that energy of people moving into their communities, aren't going to grow long term. And that's something we know.
So we've got about a minute left, but I would imagine there's somebody in our audience who's a little uncomfortable right now. To have a conversation that's saying, with increasing diversity, comes, the kinds of disparities that we're talking about: life expectancy, undereducation, lack of availability or access to jobs. We're going to come back to that in just a moment, because I don't want to leave people with the impression that the growth of Metro Atlanta and the diversity is a cause for some of the problems that we're talking about. We're going to be right back in just a second.